A peaceful evening suddenly turned into a nightmare. Amara Johnson, the brave FBI director, was pulled over by a white police officer without reason. But the story did not end there. Sarcasm, threats, and a gun drawn in the dark of night fueled the fire of injustice and racism. What the officer didn't know, the woman he was insulting wasn't just powerful. She was a symbol of justice. Amara was driving home at dusk, her sleek black SUV gliding smoothly down a quiet road. She had just finished a long day at work as the director of a large FBI branch. Tonight, she had only one plan: a cozy dinner and a few hours of relaxation with her favorite book. But fate had other plans. Red and blue lights flashed behind her, their glow bouncing in her rearview mirror. A loud siren blared, signaling her to pull over. A small smirk crossed Amara's lips, not from amusement, but from sarcasm. She hadn't broken any traffic laws. Her speed was within the limit. Her turn signals had been used correctly every time she turned. She knew what this was about. Taking a deep breath, she pulled the car to the side of the road and stopped. Amara turned on her headlights, making sure everything was clearly visible, a habit ingrained in her as a black woman living in America. Not because she distrusted the law, but because she knew sometimes the people enforcing it weren't fair. A tall white man in a police uniform approached from behind. His posture was strict, but something about his energy felt off. He knocked on Amara's window, his eyes filled with doubt. Amara rolled down the window, keeping her face calm and professional. "Hello, officer. How may I help you?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. The police officer, Daniel Carter, squinted at her for a long moment before speaking. "Driver's license and registration." Amara didn't react immediately. "What happened? Can you tell me why you stopped the car?" she asked, her voice staying even. Daniel shrugged, his tone flat. "You look suspicious. I need to check your papers to make sure everything is in order." Amara's forehead creased slightly, but her expression remained steady. "Suspicious," she repeated. "Could you explain?" "I don't think looking suspicious is a valid reason to stop someone under the law." Daniel's face darkened. His patience was wearing thin. "Are you going to argue with the police?" he snapped. "Don't make things difficult. Just show your papers." Amara's grip tightened slightly on the steering wheel. She had been here before, but something about tonight felt different. She could see it in his eyes. This wasn't just about a traffic stop. This was something more. And Amara knew this was just the beginning. Daniel squinted at her, studying her face for a long moment before answering. "Driver's license and registration." Amara kept her expression neutral. "What happened? Can you tell me why you stopped the car?" she asked again, keeping her tone calm and measured. Daniel shrugged, his voice flat. "You look suspicious," he said. "I need to check your papers to make sure everything is in order." Amara frowned slightly, but her gaze remained steady. "Suspicious?" she repeated. "Could you explain?" "I don't think looking suspicious is a valid reason to stop someone under the law." Daniel's face hardened. His patience was slipping. "Are you going to argue with the police?" he snapped. "Don't make things difficult. Just show your papers." Amara took a slow breath, keeping herself calm. She reached for her license and registration, pulling them out of the document holder. But she didn't hand them over. "Not yet." "I know the law, officer," she said, her voice firm but respectful. "And I know I have the right to ask for a proper reason. If you can't provide one, this is an abuse of power." Daniel's face twisted in anger. Without warning, he slammed his hand on the car door, the loud noise breaking the silence. Amara's fingers tightened slightly around her steering wheel. She had been in tense situations before, but something about this officer, his hostility, his aggression, felt different. Daniel's voice grew sharp. "Don't lecture me about the law," he spat. "I'm the one enforcing the law here. You don't get to tell me how to do my job." The air inside the car felt thick with tension. Headlights from passing cars flashed briefly, but no one stopped. No one saw what was happening. Amara kept her breathing steady. This wasn't the first time she had faced a situation like this. But tonight felt different. The look in Daniel's eyes wasn't just authority. It was control. And Amara knew this was far from over. Amara took a deep breath, telling herself to stay calm. She had handled many difficult situations before, But something about this moment felt different. There was hostility in Daniel's voice, a tension that had nothing to do with law enforcement and everything to do with power. Daniel stood there, arms crossed, blocking her view of the road. His presence was meant to be intimidating, and for most people, it probably would have been, but not for Amara. She kept her voice level, her eyes steady. "Officer," she said carefully, "I stopped the car at your request. I have no intention of resisting, but I will not comply with unreasonable demands without a valid reason." Daniel's face twitched with irritation. "Who do you think you are?" he asked, his voice edged with anger. "Don't act like you know everything." He took a step closer, his posture tense. "I said hand over the papers, so just do it." Amara didn't flinch. She still held the papers in her hand, but she refused to hand them over immediately. "I am a law-abiding citizen, officer," she said, her voice controlled but firm. "And I believe you know that too." Daniel's agitation grew. His eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched. He shined his flashlight through the window, the bright beam hitting Amara's face directly. She resisted the instinct to look away. "Are you carrying anything illegal?" Daniel asked, his voice sharp. "Drugs? Weapons?" His words were not random. Amara knew exactly what he was implying. The assumption was clear. And that assumption? It had nothing to do with the law. Amara's chest tightened, but she kept her composure. "No, officer," she said evenly. "And I don't believe you have any reason to doubt that." She let the words settle for a moment. Then, her tone shifted slightly, still calm, but edged with warning. "And I suggest," she continued, "that you don't insult me." Daniel let out a low, humorless chuckle. "I don't need a reason to doubt you," he muttered. His voice lowered, turning almost cold. "And I don't need to show any respect to people like you." The words hit the air like a sharp blade. Amara's grip tightened on the steering wheel. She had heard those words before, but never this directly, and never like this. Daniel leaned in closer, his voice now just above a whisper. "I just need to do my job," he said. "And if you don't cooperate..." A pause. His hand rested on his belt. A deliberate move. His next words? A threat. "I'll be forced to take drastic measures." Amara felt the shift immediately. This wasn't just aggression anymore. This was something else. Something dangerous. She met his gaze, her voice unwavering. "I am perfectly willing to cooperate," she said. "If you follow proper procedures." A tense silence filled the air. Daniel's eyes bored into her, as if trying to break her composure. But Amara? She didn't look away. She refused to be intimidated. Because she knew this was only the beginning. Amara remained seated in the car, her fingers tightening slightly on the steering wheel. She had handled dangerous situations before. But something about this was different. Daniel stood in front of the car, his arms crossed tightly, his eyes filled with hostility. His body language made one thing very clear. He wasn't interested in following proper procedures. This wasn't about a traffic stop anymore. This was about power. And Amara? She refused to give in. Daniel's voice cut through the silence, sharp and loud. "Who do you think you are to challenge me?" he demanded. "This is not a negotiation. Either you cooperate, or I will be forced to take drastic action." Amara kept her voice calm. "Officer, I am not resisting," she said. "I am simply asking you to follow procedure. If you cannot provide a valid reason for stopping me, I reserve the right to refuse further cooperation." Her words only fueled his anger. Daniel's face darkened, his jaw clenching tightly. He suddenly raised his hand, pointing his finger directly at her face. "Enough," he snapped. "Get out of the car. Now." Amara stared at him for a long moment, sensing the danger in his tone, in his movements. But she didn't move. "I'm not getting out of this car without a valid reason," she said firmly. "I do not feel safe stepping out." Daniel stepped closer, his boots thudding heavily against the pavement. His knuckles rapped hard against the car door, the sound loud and aggressive. "Get out of the car," he ordered, his voice rising. "That's an order." Amara remained still. She had spent her career training hundreds of agents on how to handle high-pressure situations. And the first rule she always taught? Stay calm. Always. Her voice did not waver. "Officer," she said evenly, "I will not obey an unlawful order." Daniel's expression twisted with anger. His hand moved to his gun holster. His fingers rested on the weapon, a silent warning. People like you, he sneered, have no right to decide what happens here. I am the one giving the orders. His hand tightened slightly around the gun. His next words? A clear threat. Do you want to see what happens if you disobey me? Amara felt her chest tighten, but she kept her composure. One wrong move, one wrong word, and this could spiral out of control. Her voice remained calm, steady, unshaken. Officer, she said carefully, I am recording this entire incident. She gestured toward the dashboard, where her phone was mounted and recording everything. Your every action is being recorded, she continued. And I will use this as evidence if this situation goes too far. Daniel's eyes flickered to the camera. For a moment, just a moment, he hesitated. Then he let out a low, mocking chuckle. You think I'm afraid of cameras? He smirked. His fingers tightened on his gun. What could someone like you really do? And then, in one swift movement, he pulled the gun from his holster and pointed it straight at Amara. The air turned suffocating. A heavy silence filled the space between them. Amara didn't move, didn't reach for anything, didn't react, because she knew one wrong move, and this would turn deadly. Her hands remained on the wheel, her breathing controlled. And then, her voice came, steady as ever. You are breaking the law, officer, she said quietly but firmly. I demand that you drop your weapon immediately. Daniel sneered, his gun still raised, his grip tightening around the handle. Don't try to be smart, girl, he muttered. His tone was dangerous now. I told you, this is not a negotiation. He took a step closer, the barrel of the gun reflecting the dim light. If you don't listen, he continued, his voice low and cold, I'll be forced to use force. Amara kept her eyes locked on him, her hands firmly gripping the steering wheel. She had faced life-threatening situations before. But this was something more personal. This wasn't just abuse of power. This was pure hatred. She knew she had to handle this carefully. One wrong move, one sudden action, and she might not survive the night. Her voice remained steady. Officer, she said slowly, I am recording this entire incident. She gestured slightly toward the dashboard, where her phone's camera was still rolling. Your every move is being documented, she continued. And if you take this too far, you will be held accountable. Daniel smirked. Do you think I'm afraid of cameras? He scoffed. His gun remained pointed at her. What could someone like you really do? Amara knew she had to act now. She needed backup. Slowly, very slowly, she moved her hand toward her phone. She made sure Daniel could see her every motion. I'm calling your superior, she stated, keeping her voice even but firm. Daniel's eyes flickered with confusion, but he didn't lower the gun. You are not allowed to call anyone without my permission, he barked. Amara ignored him. She dialed. A moment later, the call connected. Her voice was calm but direct. Hello, she said. This is Amara Johnson, director of the FBI. I have been pulled over and threatened at gunpoint by an officer named Daniel Carter. She paused slightly, letting the weight of her words sink in. He pointed a gun at me without legal justification, she continued. I request that the sheriff come immediately to handle this situation. Daniel's face twitched, but his gun didn't lower. What are you doing? He demanded. Do you really think you can get away with this without listening to me? Amara's eyes did not waver. I'm not trying to get away with anything, she replied. Her voice was calm, but there was steel behind it. I am asking for fairness and transparency. And if you do not comply with the law, her eyes narrowed slightly. You will face the consequences. Daniel's fingers tightened slightly on the trigger. For a brief moment, the two stood at a stalemate. One side fueled by hatred and abuse of power, the other by patience and courage. And then, in the distance, a siren sounded. A second police car approached quickly, its lights flashing. Daniel's posture shifted. For the first time, his expression showed uncertainty. His anger remained. But now there was something else. Fear. The new patrol car stopped behind them, and from inside, the sheriff stepped out. The sheriff walked forward with purpose, his eyes scanning the situation. Daniel tensed up, his grip on the gun loosening slightly. The moment had shifted. The power? No longer in his hands. Sheriff Grant's voice was firm. Carter, he said, his tone sharp and commanding. What the hell is going on here? Daniel hesitated, then slowly turned toward his superior. But the gun? It was still in his hand. Put the gun down, Grant ordered. Amara remained silent, watching Daniel's next move. This was it. This was the moment where everything would be decided. Daniel's eyes darted between Amara and the sheriff. For the first time, his face showed something other than arrogance. He looked uncertain. Slowly, his hand lowered, the gun moving away from Amara's direction. Sheriff Grant's face was unreadable as he took another step closer. Carter, he repeated, his voice now ice cold. What the hell do you think you're doing? Daniel stammered, trying to regain control. Sir, she wasn't cooperating, he said, his voice shaky. I asked her to step out of the car multiple times, but she refused. She even filmed everything to threaten me. The sheriff's expression hardened. You think that's a good reason to pull a gun on someone? A pause. Do you even understand what you've just done? Daniel's face paled slightly, but he stood his ground. I was just following procedures, sir, he insisted. She wasn't complying. Sheriff Grant let out a slow, heavy sigh. Then he turned to Amara. His eyes widened slightly as recognition hit him. You're Amara Johnson, he said, his voice carrying a mix of shock and realization. The FBI director. Amara nodded slowly, her face calm but sharp. Yes, sir, she said. I was on my way home when I was stopped without cause. She held the sheriff's gaze, her voice clear and unwavering. I tried to cooperate within the law, but Officer Carter's actions were beyond acceptable. Daniel visibly stiffened. Grant's face darkened with disappointment. He slowly turned back to Daniel. Carter, he said, his tone dangerously low. Don't you recognize her? Daniel didn't answer. His silence was his first real mistake. Grant's jaw tightened. You just made a terrible mistake, he muttered. Daniel's hands curled into fists. I didn't know, he mumbled. She didn't present any. Grant cut him off with a glare. Procedure, he snapped. What procedure allows you to pull a gun on someone who was never a threat? Daniel looked down, unable to meet Grant's stare. What procedure allows you to insult and threaten a citizen? His voice turned sharp as steel, especially when that citizen is the FBI director. A heavy silence filled the air. Amara exhaled slowly, waiting. Sheriff Grant stared at Daniel for a long moment, then finally turned back to Amara. Miss Johnson, he said. His tone had shifted from authority to respect. I assure you, this will be handled immediately. Amara didn't break eye contact. I recorded everything, she said firmly. Every word, every action. She took a step forward. I'm not just asking for an explanation, Sheriff, she continued. I'm demanding a full investigation. Grant nodded once, his jaw clenched. You'll have it. And just like that, Daniel Carter's world began to crumble. Sheriff Grant's expression was stone cold as he turned back to Daniel. His voice dropped, filled with restrained anger. Carter, he said, his words slow and sharp. Hand over your weapon. Daniel froze, his fingers instinctively tightening around his gun. Sir, now. The command was final. Daniel hesitated. But then, realization hit him. There was no way out of this. Slowly, he pulled the gun from his holster and handed it over. Grant took it, examining it for a moment before slipping it into his pocket. Then, without hesitation, he said the words that sealed Daniel's fate. Carter, you are hereby officially suspended from duty. Daniel's face drained of color. The words landed like a blow, but he still tried to argue his way out. Sir, I was just... Enough. Grant's tone cut through the night air like a knife. We will be conducting a full investigation into your actions. The sheriff gestured toward two other officers who had arrived at the scene. Take him in. The officers stepped forward, their movements swift and professional. Daniel stiffened, his jaw clenched tight. Sir, this is a mistake, he protested. But even he didn't believe his own words anymore. As the officers grabbed his arms, he didn't fight back. He knew. He had lost. Amara watched silently, her face calm but unyielding. This wasn't about revenge. This was about justice. Before leaving, she turned to Sheriff Grant. Her voice was sharp, yet controlled. I hope you take this seriously, she said. Not just because I'm the FBI director. Her eyes locked onto his. But because this could happen to anyone. A beat of silence passed. Then Grant nodded firmly. You have my word, Miss Johnson, he said. This matter will not be ignored. Amara took a slow breath. And for the first time that night, she finally felt in control. Behind her, Daniel Carter was being led away in handcuffs. The other officers stood silently, their expressions heavy with realization. Because this wasn't just a lesson for one man. It was a warning to all. The next morning, the entire department was on edge. Sheriff Grant had ordered an immediate internal investigation, and the news of Daniel Carter's suspension had already started to spread. Inside the station, officers whispered among themselves. Some were shocked, some were angry, but most, they were worried. Because this wasn't just about one officer's mistake. This was about a system that had allowed it to happen. Amara sat in the police oversight boardroom, a file open in front of her. She had seen cases like this before, but this time, she was the victim, and she wasn't going to let it slide. A senior investigator cleared his throat. Miss Johnson, he said, we've reviewed your video evidence and spoken with Sheriff Grant. Officer Carter's actions were clearly a violation of conduct. Amara didn't react. She had expected that much. But she wasn't here for just one officer's punishment. I appreciate the swift action, she said. But I want more than just a suspension. The investigator raised an eyebrow. What exactly are you asking for? Amara leaned forward. Her voice was sharp, unwavering. A full-scale review of department policies. Not just Carter's behavior, but the entire system that allowed him to feel untouchable. The room fell silent. A few board members shifted in their seats. They knew what she was asking. And they knew this wasn't going to be easy. One man, sitting near the edge of the table, sighed. Miss Johnson, he said, this kind of investigation could cause a lot of pushback. Amara's eyes narrowed slightly. I don't care about pushback, she said. I care about accountability. A tense pause. Then, Sheriff Grant spoke up. She's right, he said, surprising everyone. This department has been ignoring problems for too long. He looked at the other officials, his voice firm. If we want to restore trust, we need to fix the problem at its core. More silence. But this time, it wasn't resistance. It was realization. Finally, the head of the oversight board let out a slow breath. All right, he said. We'll open the review. Amara nodded once. Because she knew. This was the first step toward real change. 2 months later, the courtroom was packed. Journalists, social activists, and ordinary citizens had all come to witness what had now become a nationally known case. At the center of it all, Daniel Carter, the officer who had once stood with unshaken arrogance, now sat silently, his face pale, his hands clenched together tightly. The judge entered. All rise. Everyone stood. The tension in the room was thick. This wasn't just a trial about one officer's misconduct. It was a test of the justice system itself. Carter's lawyer stood up, trying to justify his actions. My client reacted in a moment of stress, he argued. He was in a difficult situation and made a rash decision. But the evidence spoke louder than words. The video was played for the jury. Every threat, every insult, every moment of abuse of power. The room watched in silence. Watched as Carter pointed his gun at an innocent woman. Watched as he ignored every law he had sworn to protect. Then, Amara Johnson took the witness stand. She stood tall, confident, and composed. And when she spoke, her voice was sharp and unwavering. Not only did he abuse his power, she said, looking directly at the jury, he also damaged public trust in the legal system. She let the words sink in. If we allow this kind of behavior to continue, she continued, the system we rely on for justice will become a system of oppression. The jury listened. The judge listened. And when the final verdict was read, the courtroom held its breath. The courtroom fell silent as the judge looked down at Daniel Carter. The jury had reached their decision. The judge's voice was clear and firm. After reviewing the evidence and hearing testimonies, this court finds Officer Daniel Carter. A pause. The tension thickened. Guilty on all counts. A ripple of emotion swept through the courtroom. Some gasped. Some nodded in quiet approval. Daniel sat motionless, his face pale, his hands trembling. His power was gone, his authority stripped away. The sentence followed swiftly. 5 years in prison, a permanent ban from law enforcement, and the mark of a disgraced officer who had failed the very oath he swore to uphold. Amara watched without emotion, because this wasn't about personal revenge. This was about justice. As she left the courthouse, cameras flashed, reporters rushed toward her. "Miss Johnson, what do you have to say about the verdict?" She stopped, turning toward the crowd. Her voice was calm, but powerful. "This is not just a victory," she said. "This is a message." She let the words settle. A message that no one is above the law. She stepped forward, her presence commanding. And that accountability, she added, is not optional. The cameras kept flashing, capturing a moment that would become a symbol of justice. Because this wasn't just the end of a case. It was the beginning of real change. And Amara Johnson? She wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot.